The bitter Iowa wind bit through Jeremiah's threadbare coat, a constant, howling reminder of his foolish ambition. It was the winter of 1848, and the land was a canvas of white and gray, an unforgiving wilderness that had swallowed countless men before him. His breath plumed out in thick clouds, and his boots, caked with frozen mud, crunched against the brittle snow. He was a trapper, a man who sought silence and solitude, but this desolation was different. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the heavy stillness of a graveyard. He'd left his past behind in the crowded, unforgiving East, hoping to find a new life in this untamed frontier. All he had found so far was the cold, a gnawing emptiness, and the specter of his own failures. For weeks he had followed the winding paths of the Skunk River, his traps yielding little more than disappointment. His supplies were dwindling, and a sense of dread, cold and sharp as the wind, had settled in his bones. He knew the stories. The whispers passed around campfires in the rare moments he encountered another soul. Tales of men who went into the woods and never returned. Most dismissed them as the exaggerations of fear. But Jeremiah, a man who had seen the darker side of humanity, knew that the most terrifying monsters didn't hide in shadows, they wore human faces. He was contemplating turning back, surrendering to the brutal elements when a wisp of smoke caught his eye. It was faint, barely more than a smudge against the grey sky, but it was a beacon of hope in this merciless landscape. He changed his course, his stiff muscles protesting with every step. As he drew closer, the scent of wood smoke mingled with the earthy smell of pine and the metallic tang of frozen air. The source was a small, well-built log cabin nestled in a clearing on a gentle rise. A single window glowed with a soft, inviting light. It was the only sign of human life he had seen in 3 days. He approached with a trapper's caution, his hand resting on the hilt of the hunting knife at his hip. The cabin was a testament to hard work, its logs tightly fitted, a sturdy stone chimney sending a plume of smoke into the sky. A stack of split firewood, neatly piled, stood against one wall. He knocked on the heavy wooden door, the sound a dull thud in the silent woods. The door opened slowly, revealing a woman. She was not the grizzled frontierswoman he'd expected. Her hair, the color of a raven's wing, was pulled back in a simple braid, and her face, though etched with a certain sadness, was framed by soft features and surprisingly clear blue eyes. Her name, she said, was Cora. Her voice was a gentle, melodic sound, a stark contrast to the harshness of the land. "You're a long way from anywhere, stranger," she said, her eyes assessing him with a quiet intensity. "Come in before you freeze." He hesitated for only a moment. The warmth of the fire spilling from the doorway was too tempting to resist. He stepped inside, shedding his coat, the heat a welcome shock to his numb body. The interior was Spartan, but tidy. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its roaring flames casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. A simple cot was tucked in one corner, and a small wooden table with a single lantern occupied the center of the room. A half-finished quilt lay on a chair beside it. "I'm Jeremiah," he said, holding his hands out to the fire. "A trapper. I've been lost for a few days. The storms are unforgiving," she finished, her gaze distant, as if she was speaking from experience. "You're lucky to have found my cabin. Many men don't." The statement was simple, almost a casual observation, but a prickle of unease ran up Jeremiah's spine. He dismissed it as a product of his exhausted mind. He was just grateful for a roof over his head and a warm fire. Cora offered him a bowl of thick stew and a piece of coarse bread, a feast to his starving stomach. As he ate, he studied her. She moved with a silent grace, her movements deliberate and controlled. She didn't ask about his past, and for that he was grateful. Instead, she spoke of the land, of the relentless cold, and of the isolation that was both a burden and a comfort. "Do you live out here alone?" he asked, the words feeling clumsy after his days of silence. She paused, her back to him as she stirred something in a small pot on the hearth. "Yes," she said softly, "for a long time now. The woods, they can be lonely, but they also offer a kind of peace." Her words were carefully chosen, almost rehearsed. Jeremiah felt a strange mix of sympathy and caution. He was a guest in a strange woman's home in the middle of nowhere. His senses, honed by years of living on the edge, were on high alert. He finished his meal, the warmth spreading through him, and leaned back, listening to the wind howl outside. It felt like a living thing, a hungry beast circling the small cabin, waiting for an opportunity. As the night wore on, a comfortable silence settled between them. The fire crackled and the wind moaned against the walls. He lay on the cot she offered, a worn wool blanket his only comfort. He watched her for a while, a silhouette against the firelight, sewing a patch onto a simple linen shirt. Her hands, though calloused, were surprisingly delicate. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, a dissonant note in the apparent harmony of their quiet evening. He was tired, exhausted to his very core, but sleep was elusive. His mind replayed the day's events, the isolation of the woods, the sudden appearance of the cabin, the woman with the sorrowful eyes. He thought of the stories he had heard, of the trappers who vanished without a trace. He dismissed the thoughts as paranoia, the result of too much solitude. Yet, as he drifted off, a faint metallic scraping sound, almost imperceptible, seemed to come from inside the walls. He shook his head, convincing himself it was the wind or the house settling. It had to be. But as he closed his eyes, a single, horrifying thought flashed into his mind. The strange statement she had made. "Many men don't." And the way she had looked at him, not with fear or pity, but with a deep, unsettling understanding. He was not a savior or a rescuer. He was just another lost soul who had walked into her world. And she, he was beginning to suspect, was the one who had been waiting. The feeling of dread was back, a cold hand gripping his heart, a terrifying premonition that this cabin was not a sanctuary, but a cage. He was trapped, and the winter had just begun. The morning brought with it a fragile peace, a thin blanket of sun that did little to thaw the frozen landscape. Jeremiah woke to the smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon, a luxury he hadn't experienced in months. The scraping sound from the night before was gone, replaced by the crackle of the fireplace and the quiet rhythm of Cora's movements. He sat up, the worn blanket sliding off his chest, and his eyes met hers across the small cabin. There was no trace of the unsettling gaze he remembered from the previous night, only a calm, almost serene expression. "You look better," she said, placing a tin plate of food on the table. "Rest does a body good." Jeremiah ate slowly, savoring every bite. The meal was simple but nourishing, a stark contrast to the hardtack and dried meat he had been surviving on. He watched her as she went about her morning chores, her movements economical and practiced. She was a woman of few words, and her silence was heavy, filled with an unreadable history. He felt the weight of it, a suffocating pressure that seemed to press in from the very walls of the cabin. He spent the day mending his traps, a task that kept him busy but not distracted. His mind kept returning to the metallic scraping sound, the feeling of unease. He tried to rationalize it, to tell himself it was just a nervous reaction to the solitude and the strange circumstances. But a gut feeling, a cold, hard knot in his stomach, told him otherwise. In the afternoon, the wind picked up again, a low, mournful howl that promised more snow. He decided to venture into the woods to check on his traps. The offer to leave, to find his own way, felt like a polite fiction, He was still too weak, and the woods were a labyrinth of blinding white and shadowed trees. "Be careful," Cora said, her voice a low murmur as he prepared to leave. "The woods have a way of swallowing people whole." The phrase, so close to his own thoughts from the night before, made him pause. He looked at her, searching for something in her eyes, a hint of meaning, a cruel joke, but found nothing. Her expression was neutral, her face a mask of calm. He gave a curt nod and stepped out into the frigid air. The woods were silent except for the soughing of the wind. The snow was deep in places, and he had to fight his way through drifts. He found his traps empty, not a single track in the fresh snow. The disappointment was a familiar ache, but it was overshadowed by a growing sense of being watched. He turned, scanning the tree line, his hand on his knife, but saw nothing. The feeling persisted, a prickle on the back of his neck, a phantom presence just beyond the edge of his vision. He found his way back to the cabin as dusk began to settle, the sky a bruised purple and gray. The window light was a welcoming sight, but his apprehension had only deepened. He stepped inside, the blast of warmth a brief comfort. Cora was seated by the fire, mending a pair of trousers. She looked up as he entered, her face unreadable. "No luck?" she asked, a simple question that held an undercurrent of something he couldn't name. "No," he said, his voice hoarse. "Not a trace." He felt her eyes on him as he peeled off his heavy coat, the fabric stiff with cold. He noticed a small, dark stain on the wooden floor near the hearth, a splotch that looked almost like dried blood. He knelt, pretending to adjust his boots, and touched it. It was dry, but the color was unmistakable. He looked at Cora, but she was looking into the fire, her profile a study in stillness. He stood up slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. That night, the scraping sound returned. It was louder this time, a rhythmic scratching that seemed to come from the walls behind his cot. It was a low, grating noise, like a file on a bone. Jeremiah lay awake, his senses on high alert, his body tense with a primal fear. He tried to convince himself it was just a rodent, a mouse or a squirrel trapped in the cabin's walls, but the rhythm was too deliberate, too slow, and the sound itself was too deep. It sounded like something being worked, a long, tedious, and methodical task. He looked across the room at Cora, who was sleeping peacefully on her own cot. The soft glow of the embers cast a warm light on her face, and for a moment she looked like a simple, harmless woman. But the sound persisted, a haunting, scraping whisper in the darkness. He couldn't stand it any longer. He got up quietly, his movements slow and deliberate. He crept across the room, his eyes on the wall behind his cot, the source of the terrible sound. The walls were made of rough-hewn logs, tightly sealed with chinking, but as he put his ear to the wood he could hear it more clearly now, the rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape. He backed away, his mind racing. What could she be doing? What was that sound? It wasn't a rat. It was too human. A chilling thought, a terrifying possibility began to take shape in his mind. He looked at the cabin, at the sturdy logs, the strong, well-built structure. And then he remembered her words. Many men don't. He thought of the other trappers, the ones who had vanished. He thought of the strange stain on the floor. He looked at Cora again. She was still asleep, a gentle, innocent-looking woman. But the sounds were real. The fear was real. He had to know. He tiptoed to the other side of the cabin, away from the sounds, and sat down on the floor, his back against the wall, listening. He tried to think, to find a logical explanation. But the logic of the world he knew was falling away, replaced by the grim, terrifying reality of this isolated place. He was in a cage, and the woman who had welcomed him in was holding the key. And he had a terrible feeling that the cage was about to get much, much smaller. He finally drifted off into a restless sleep, filled with visions of bones scraping against wood, of a woman with a file in her hand, her face a serene mask, her eyes cold and empty. He woke with a start just before dawn, the sounds gone, the cabin silent once more. But the fear remained, a cold and heavy weight in the pit of his stomach. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he was no longer a guest. He was a prisoner, and the walls, he now knew, were not just holding in the warmth. They were holding in a secret, a terrible, gruesome secret. The morning after the scraping sounds, a thick, blinding blizzard descended upon the cabin, trapping Jeremiah and Cora inside. The world outside was a swirling vortex of white, the wind a furious shriek against the sturdy logs. The isolation, which had once been a source of uneasy tension, now became a suffocating reality. There was no escape. Jeremiah's paranoia had reached a fever pitch. He watched Cora's every move, his senses heightened, searching for a single clue, a single sign that his fears were justified. She, in turn, seemed to notice nothing. She went about her daily routine with an almost eerie tranquility, mending clothes, cooking meals, and staring into the fire with a vacant, distant expression. The calm on her face was a terrifying contrast to the storm of fear raging inside him. The hours passed with a dragging slowness. Jeremiah found himself pacing the small room, his mind a whirlwind of terrifying possibilities. He was a trapper, a man who had faced down bears and blizzards, but this silent psychological game was something new. He had always been a man of action, of physical confrontation, but here he was helpless, his body a useless tool against an unseen and unknown enemy. He decided to distract himself, to try and find a logical explanation for the scraping sound. He began to examine the cabin's walls, running his hands over the rough logs, searching for a loose spot, a crack, anything that could reveal the source of the noise. Cora was busy with some mending near the fire, her back to him. He was discreet, his movements casual, but he knew she was aware of his every action. His fingers ran over a spot on the wall behind the cot, and he felt it, a small, almost imperceptible gap between two logs. It was not a crack. It was a deliberate space, a fissure that seemed to have been carved out. He pressed on it, and the piece of wood shifted slightly. His heart began to pound, a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He felt the cold touch of dread. He glanced at Cora, but she was still focused on her work, her head bent low. He had to be careful. He had to be smart. He couldn't let her know what he was doing. He moved away from the wall, feigning a need to stretch, and then casually returned, this time with his hunting knife in his hand. He knelt, pretending to adjust a lace on his boot, and slipped the tip of the knife into the crack. The wood was soft, a deliberate cut. He worked slowly, carefully, prying at the log. It gave way with a soft creak, and he pulled it out, a small, splintered piece of wood in his hand. He looked into the gap, and the sight that greeted him was a punch to the gut. The smell was the first thing to hit him, a dry, musty odor, the scent of a grave. Inside the wall, neatly stacked, were bones. Not animal bones. These were human, a femur, a rib cage, a collection of smaller, more delicate bones. They were clean, polished, and bleached to a stark white. He stared, his mind struggling to comprehend the horror. The scraping sound. It wasn't a mouse or a squirrel. It was her, filing down the bones, polishing them, keeping them as trophies. He felt a wave of nausea, a cold, sickening realization. The fear he had been feeling, the paranoia, it wasn't just in his head. It was real. This cabin, this seemingly peaceful sanctuary, was a tomb. And the woman he had trusted, the woman who had given him food and warmth, was a monster. He quickly shoved the piece of wood back into the gap, his hands shaking, his heart a drum of terror in his ears. He stood up, his body rigid with shock, and looked at Cora. She was looking at him now. Her eyes, those beautiful, unsettling blue eyes, were fixed on him. There was no emotion on her face, no surprise, no anger, just a quiet, unnerving stillness. "You've seen them," she said, her voice a soft, flat whisper that cut through the roaring of the wind. "The others." Jeremiah felt his blood run cold. She hadn't asked if he had seen something. She stated it as a fact. She knew. She had known all along. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice a low, trembling croak. A faint smile, a ghost of a cruel expression, touched her lips and was gone. "I'm the one who waits," she said, her voice still a whisper. "The one who lives in the silence." She rose to her feet, her movements still graceful, but there was a new, menacing purpose to them now. She walked toward him, the firelight catching the glint of a small, polished object in her hand. It was a bone, a human finger bone, perfectly smooth, a gruesome charm. "Don't be afraid, Jeremiah," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I'm not going to hurt you, not yet. The blizzard, and it's a test of your patience and of mine." Jeremiah's mind was a maelstrom of fear and disbelief. He was trapped in a cabin with a serial killer, a woman who collected human bones and kept them in her walls like a gruesome art collection. He had no weapons, no way out, and the storm outside was a solid, impenetrable wall of snow. He was alone with his hunter, and the game had just begun. The confession didn't come with anger or a dramatic monologue. It came with the quiet calm of a woman explaining her life's work. Cora sat by the fire, her hands busy with a piece of needlework, a small grotesque embroidery of bones and twisted trees. Jeremiah, his back against the opposite wall, watched her, his body a coiled spring of fear and adrenaline. "They're all the same," she said, her voice as soft and steady as the falling snow outside. "They come here, filled with their own ambitions, their own greed. They see the land and they think it's theirs for the taking. They see me and they think I'm just a lonely woman in the woods, an easy mark." Jeremiah didn't speak. He just listened, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He was a trapper, a man who had seen men at their worst, but this was a new level of depravity. "My husband, he came here with big dreams," she continued, her eyes distant, lost in a painful memory. "He built this cabin with his own 2 hands, but the winter, it broke him. He went out one day, searching for food, and never came back. I was alone. For weeks I sat here, waiting. The cold, the hunger. They make you see things clearly. They make you understand the true nature of the world." She looked at him then, her gaze piercing. "The world is not for the weak, Jeremiah. It's for the patient, for the ones who know how to wait. The first man who came here, he was a trapper just like you. He saw me alone, and he saw an opportunity. He thought I was a victim. He was wrong." A flicker of something dark and ancient passed through her eyes. "I learned to hunt, not for deer or for wolves, for men. They're much more predictable, much easier to trap. They follow their own greed, their own lust, their own pride. They're just animals, Jeremiah, just animals in a different kind of fur." Jeremiah felt a wave of cold revulsion. This was not a mad woman. This was a predator. She was sane, lucid, and utterly terrifying. She saw her actions not as a crime, but as a form of natural selection, a righteous act of survival. "The bones," he managed to say, his voice a dry rasp. "Why the bones?" Cora smiled, a slow, chilling smile that didn't reach her eyes. "A reminder," she said, holding up a small, polished bone. "A reminder of my strength, of my patience, and a reminder of what happens to those who underestimate me." The blizzard raged outside, a living metaphor for his predicament. He was trapped in a cage with a monster, and she was toying with him, enjoying his terror. He had to be careful, He had to be smart. He couldn't fight her. She was stronger than she looked, and she had the home advantage. He had to outwit her, to find a way to escape. He began to feign a sense of resignation. He told her about his life, his past failures, his escape to the wilderness. He spoke of his fears, his regrets, the heavy burden of his past. He laid his soul bare, not out of honesty, but out of a desperate need to make himself seem weak, harmless, just another lost soul in the wilderness. Cora listened, her expression unchanging, her hands still moving with the practiced rhythm of her needlework. He could feel her studying him, her eyes dissecting his words, his posture, his every move. He knew she was a master of reading people, a skill honed by years of waiting and watching. "You're different from the others, Jeremiah," she said at last, her voice a low murmur. "You're not just a man looking for a fortune. You're a man running from a ghost. I see it in your eyes." He felt a cold wave of fear. She saw through his act. He was not a victim in her eyes. He was a potential threat, a new kind of challenge. The game had just shifted, and he was losing. He had to change his approach. He couldn't pretend to be weak. He had to show her he was a man who understood the wilderness, a man who was not easily broken. He had to become the prey that was too much of a hassle to hunt. He had to become a survivor. But as he sat there, watching her, a new, more horrifying thought crossed his mind. The bones in the walls, the quiet confession, the terrifying calm on her face. What if she was not just a killer? What if she was something more, something darker, a creature born of the woods and the cold and the loneliness? He had to get out. He had to find a way to escape this tomb, to leave this living nightmare behind. The blizzard finally broke on the third day, leaving behind a world of pristine, dazzling white. The sun, a cold and distant orb, cast long blue shadows across the snow. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed in on the cabin. It was a silence filled with unspoken threats, with the memory of the bones in the walls. Jeremiah knew his time was running out. He had to make a move to find a way to escape. The cabin felt like a pressure cooker, the tension between him and Cora growing with every passing hour. He watched her, looking for a weakness, a moment of distraction, anything he could use to his advantage. She was different now, more watchful. The polite, distant hostess had been replaced by a quiet predator. She didn't smile, didn't make small talk. She just watched him, her eyes following his every move. The unspoken question was always in the air. When will you try to escape? He went out to chop firewood, the biting cold a welcome sensation against his skin. It was a pretense, a way to be outside to assess his options. He knew he couldn't just run. The snow was too deep, the cold too brutal. He would never make it more than a few miles. He had to be smart, to plan his escape meticulously. As he worked, his axe rising and falling with a rhythmic thud, he noticed something in the distance. A faint trail of smoke, much like the one that had led him to this cabin. It was barely visible, a wisp of gray against the vast expanse of white. But it was there. Hope, a fragile and terrifying thing, fluttered in his chest. It meant there was another cabin, another person, maybe a whole settlement. He wasn't alone. He finished his work and returned to the cabin, the secret knowledge of the smoke trail a heavy weight in his mind. He had to get to that smoke. He had to get to that person. He began to lay his plan. He would wait until night when she was sleeping. He would sneak out, taking only what he needed to survive. He would follow the trail of smoke, and he would not stop until he was safe. That night, he lay on his cot, pretending to sleep, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of Cora's breathing. He waited for hours, his heart a frantic drum, his body tense with anticipation. The fire had died down to a bed of glowing embers, and the cabin was plunged into a deep, velvety darkness. He slipped out of the cot, his movements slow and silent. He grabbed his coat and a small sack of food he had managed to hide during the day. He crept toward the door, his hand reaching for the latch. His breath was a small, white cloud in the cold air. But as his fingers closed around the cold metal of the latch, a voice, a soft, low whisper, came from the darkness behind him. "Going somewhere, Jeremiah." He froze. His heart leaped into his throat. He turned slowly, his eyes trying to pierce the darkness. He could barely make out her silhouette, a dark shape against the faint glow of the embers. She hadn't moved. She was still in her bed, a ghost in the darkness. But she was awake. She had been waiting for him. "The snow is deep, Jeremiah," she said, her voice a low, mocking murmur. "And the cold is unforgiving. You won't make it." He didn't answer. He just stood there, his hand still on the latch, his body rigid with fear and defeat. She had seen through him. She had known all along what he was planning. She rose from her bed, her movements a fluid, graceful glide in the darkness. She walked toward him, a small, dark shape in her hand. It was the same finger bone he had seen before, its polished surface catching the faint light of the embers. "I told you I'm patient," she said, her voice filled with a terrible, quiet triumph. "I'm a hunter, Jeremiah. And you're a good hunt. A patient one, a challenging one." She walked past him, her hand brushing his arm, a cold, alien touch that made him recoil. She reached the door and slipped a heavy wooden bar into place, the sound a final, definitive click in the silent cabin. He was trapped. There was no escape. He stood there, frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs. The hope he had felt, the smoke trail, the possibility of escape, all of it had been a foolish dream. He was a pawn in a game he couldn't win, a prisoner in a cage he couldn't escape. And the hunter was just getting started. The next morning, the despair was a tangible presence in the cabin, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed down on Jeremiah. He knew he couldn't try to escape again. She was too smart, too perceptive. She was always one step ahead. He was a fly in a spider's web, and she was just biding her time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He spent the day in a state of silent, gnawing fear. He ate the food she gave him, a grim, life-sustaining ritual. He worked, chopping wood, mending a tear in his coat, his hands moving with a mechanical rhythm, his mind a maelstrom of terror. He was a man in a living nightmare, and the monster was sitting across from him, a serene expression on her face. It was in the afternoon, as the weak winter sun began to dip below the horizon, that the sound came. It was not the wind, not the crackle of the fire, not the scraping of bone. It was a man's voice, a hearty, booming sound that carried on the cold air. Jeremiah froze, his blood running cold with a mix of fear and an almost unbearable surge of hope. A visitor, someone else, a witness, a chance for salvation. Cora looked up from her mending, her face a mask of surprise, a genuine human expression he had never seen before. She didn't look afraid, just irritated, as if an unwelcome interruption had broken the silent game she was playing. The voice came again, closer now. "Hello, the cabin. Anyone home?" Jeremiah's mind raced. He had to act. He had to speak. He had to do something. He opened his mouth to shout, to scream for help, but before a sound could escape, Cora was on her feet, her hand clamped over his mouth with a strength that was shocking. "Not a sound, Jeremiah," she whispered, her eyes fixed on his, a cold, lethal fire in their blue depths. "Not a sound, or the only thing they'll find is your grave." She held him pinned against the wall, her grip like a vice. He could see the man now, a large, burly trapper, his face red from the cold, his pack slung over one shoulder. He was walking toward the cabin, his boots crunching on the snow. Cora released Jeremiah, a chilling, silent command in her eyes. "Sit," she said, her voice a low hiss. "Act like you've been here all along. You're a guest, a very, very grateful guest. Understand?" Jeremiah, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline, nodded slowly. He sat down by the fire, his hands shaking, his eyes on the door. He was a prisoner playing a part, and the price of failure was his life. The man knocked on the door, a loud, solid rap that echoed in the silent cabin. Cora opened the door, a polite, almost welcoming smile on her face. "Well, hello there," the man said, his eyes scanning the interior of the cabin, his gaze landing on Jeremiah. "Didn't expect to see another soul out here. My name's Thomas O'Malley." "I'm Cora," she said, her voice a soft, gentle melody. "And this is Jeremiah. He got caught in the blizzard, just like you." Jeremiah gave a weak nod, his throat too dry to speak. He felt Thomas's eyes on him, a curious, assessing look. He had to do something. He had to give him a sign, a look, a hint. But Cora was watching him, a silent, deadly promise in her eyes. Thomas came in, shedding his coat, his large frame filling the small cabin. The air filled with his boisterous presence, and for a moment, Jeremiah felt a flicker of hope. He was a witness. He was a shield. "The snow is deep out there," Thomas said, rubbing his hands together by the fire. "I was getting close to giving up. Lucky I saw your cabin." Cora gave him a soft, knowing smile. "Luck has a strange way of finding people in these woods," she said, her eyes on Jeremiah. The conversation that followed was a torturous dance, a tense ballet of lies and half-truths. Jeremiah was a silent spectator, a prisoner in his own body. He couldn't speak, couldn't act, couldn't give away the game. He felt a terrible sense of helplessness, of lost opportunity. Thomas, a talkative and friendly man, spoke of his trapping routes, of the settlements he had passed, of the long journey he had made from the east. He was oblivious to the tension in the room, to the silent threat that hung in the air. Jeremiah listened, his mind racing. He had to find a way to warn him. But how? With Cora's eyes on him, with her silent, deadly promises, he was paralyzed. He was a man drowning, and the lifeline he had been thrown was just out of reach. The arrival of Thomas O'Malley had changed the dynamics of the cabin. The tense, silent game between Jeremiah and Cora was now a public spectacle, a dangerous performance where every word, every glance, held a hidden meaning. Jeremiah was a man on a tightrope, and below him was a chasm of bones and silence. Thomas, oblivious to the undercurrents of terror, was a boisterous and friendly man. He was a walking symbol of what Jeremiah had lost: freedom, companionship, and the simple belief that the world was a safe and predictable place. He spoke of his life, his family back in Pennsylvania, and his plans to build a new life in the West. He was everything Jeremiah had once been, a man with hope in his heart and a future in his eyes. And Jeremiah felt a terrible sense of responsibility for his life. Cora, the perfect hostess, played her part with a chilling grace. She offered Thomas a meal, a clean blanket, and a warm spot by the fire. Her smile was disarmingly gentle, her eyes filled with a feigned warmth. She was a master of deception, a predator wearing the skin of a nurturer. Jeremiah spent the night in a state of silent agony, his mind a maelstrom of possibilities and dangers. He had to warn Thomas. He couldn't let him become another bone in the wall. But every time he tried to make eye contact, every time he tried to signal him, Cora was there, her eyes a silent, deadly warning. The next morning, the sun rose on a world of sparkling snow. Thomas, rested and refreshed, announced his intention to leave. "I have a lot of ground to cover," he said, pulling on his boots. "Thank you for the hospitality, Cora. You're a true godsend." Jeremiah felt a frantic surge of panic. He couldn't let him leave. He had to stop him. He had to find a way. He stood up, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and desperation. "Thomas, wait," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. Thomas paused, turning to him, his brow furrowed in concern. "What is it, Jeremiah?" Cora was suddenly beside him, her hand on his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "He's just tired, Thomas," she said, her voice filled with a feigned concern. "The cold and the stress, they've taken a toll." Jeremiah pulled his arm away, his eyes fixed on Thomas's. "No, listen to me," he said, his voice rising, a note of desperation in it. "This isn't what you think it is. You have to get out of here. Now." Thomas looked from Jeremiah to Cora, a flicker of confusion and alarm in his eyes. "What are you talking about, Jeremiah?" Cora's face for the first time showed a hint of something other than calm. It was a flash of cold fury, a silent, deadly promise. "He's not well, Thomas," she said, her voice low and menacing. "He's been seeing things." Jeremiah knew he had to act. He had to give him proof. He had to show him the truth. He looked at the wall behind the cot, the wall with the bones. He knew he couldn't just tear it open. It would be too obvious, too slow. He had to be quick to be shocking. He ran to his cot and pulled out his hunting knife, its blade catching the light. He turned to Thomas, his voice a desperate plea. "Don't listen to her. The walls. She has them. The bones. She's a killer." Thomas looked at him, his face a mask of disbelief and fear. He backed away slowly, his eyes wide. He thought Jeremiah was insane. He thought he was dangerous. Cora, seeing her opportunity, moved with a terrifying speed. She grabbed a small, heavy piece of wood from the kindling pile by the fire and brought it down on the back of Jeremiah's head. The world exploded into a flash of blinding white, a searing pain, and then nothing. Jeremiah awoke to a dull, throbbing pain in his head and the suffocating scent of dust and wood smoke. He was lying on the floor, a single rough blanket covering him. His hands were tied behind his back, a tight, chafing knot that cut into his skin. His hunting knife was gone. He sat up slowly, his head spinning, and looked around. The cabin was silent. The fire was a dying bed of embers. Thomas was gone. His heart sank, a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He had failed. He had tried to warn him, but he had only succeeded in getting himself knocked out and tied up. Thomas had left, believing him to be a madman, a danger. He was another lost soul, another victim in the making, and there was nothing Jeremiah could do about it. Cora was sitting in her usual spot by the fire, her hands busy with a small, polished bone. She looked up as he stirred, her face a serene mask. "He's gone," she said, her voice a low, steady murmur. "He thinks you're insane. He'll go and tell his stories and no one will believe him, just another crazy man in the woods. And you tried to ruin my game, Jeremiah. That was a mistake." Jeremiah felt a wave of impotent rage. He had tried to save a life, to be a hero, but he had only sealed his own fate. He was a fool. "Why?" he managed to say, his voice a hoarse croak. "Why do you do this?" Cora looked at him, her eyes filled with a cold, ancient weariness. "It's what I am," she said, a simple, chilling statement. "The woods, they mold you, Jeremiah. They make you strong. They make you a hunter. And the men who come here, they are the prey. It's the natural order of things." She rose to her feet, her movement still graceful, and walked toward him. She knelt down, her face close to his, her eyes unblinking. "You will be a part of the collection, Jeremiah, a permanent resident of this cabin. Your bones will join the others in the walls, a monument to my patience, to my strength." She reached out and traced the line of his jaw with a finger, a cold, unsettling touch. "But I'm not going to rush it. I'm going to wait. I'm going to watch you, Jeremiah. I'm going to watch you as you lose all hope, as you realize that you are truly, completely alone. And then, only then, will I make you a part of my story." She stood up, and for a long moment, she just looked at him, her eyes filled with a terrible, knowing triumph. She was a master of her craft, a predator who had found a new, more challenging toy. And he was a prisoner in his own body, his mind a battlefield of terror and despair. He had to find a way out. He couldn't just sit here and wait to die. He had to be smart. He had to be cunning. He had to use what he had, his mind, his will to survive, to find a way to escape. He looked at the cabin, at the walls, at the woman who was holding him captive, and a single desperate thought formed in his mind. He had to turn the tables. He had to become the hunter. The despair gave way to a cold, ruthless resolve. Jeremiah realized that his only chance was to outwit her. He was a trapper. He knew about bait and traps and the art of the hunt. He had been the prey for too long. It was time to become the hunter. He began to observe her with a new intensity. He watched her movements, her habits, the small details of her life. He noticed that she was most relaxed when she was working on her needlework or polishing her bones. It was a form of meditation for her, a time when her guard was down. He had to find a way to exploit that moment of weakness. He also noticed that she was meticulous, almost pathologically so. She had a place for everything, a routine she followed with a religious fervor. The axe was always left outside, leaned against the woodpile. The knife she used for her gruesome hobby was always placed on a small shelf above the hearth. These were her patterns, her habits, her vulnerabilities. He started to feign a sense of resignation, of brokenness. He stopped fighting, stopped struggling. He ate what she gave him, his face a mask of defeat. He told her stories, sad, pathetic tales of his life, his failures, his regrets. He acted like a man who had given up, a man who was ready for his fate. Cora, a master of reading people, seemed to believe his act. The triumphant gleam in her eyes softened into a sort of pity. She began to untie his hands during the day, a small show of trust. "You're no longer a threat, Jeremiah," she said, a hint of something that sounded like satisfaction in her voice. "You're just a guest, a long-term guest." He played along, his heart a drum of anticipation. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, a predator in a cage. He had to be patient. He had to wait for the perfect moment. The opportunity came on the fourth day. She was engrossed in her work, her head bent low over a skull, a small, intricate file in her hand. The fire was roaring, casting a warm, deceptive light on her face. Her guard was down. Jeremiah, his heart hammering against his ribs, got up slowly. He walked to the water bucket, his movements slow and deliberate, feigning a need for a drink. He walked past her, his eyes on the shelf above the hearth. The bone file was there. It was his only weapon, his only chance. He took a long, slow drink from the bucket, his mind racing. He had to make a move. He had to be quick. He had to be lethal. He placed the bucket back on the floor and walked past her again, this time with a silent purpose. He reached the hearth, his hand reaching for the small shelf. His fingers closed around the cold, smooth handle of the file. He turned, the file a small deadly weapon in his hand. Cora, her face still bent low over the skull, did not look up. She was completely engrossed. Jeremiah took a deep breath, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. He was about to do something he had never done before. He was about to kill a woman. But as he raised his hand, a sound, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, came from the floorboards near the hearth. A quiet click. He looked down, and he saw it. A thin, almost invisible wire stretched taut across the floor, leading to a small, hidden mechanism in the hearth. It was a trap, A trap set for him. She had been testing him. She had been waiting. He froze, his hand in mid-air. He looked at Cora, and she slowly raised her head, a slow, chilling smile on her face. Her eyes, those beautiful, unsettling blue eyes, were filled with a terrible, knowing triumph. "Did you think I was a fool, Jeremiah?" she whispered, her voice a low, mocking murmur. "Did you think I would let you escape so easily? I'm a hunter, Jeremiah. I know my prey. I know what they'll do. I knew you would try something." She stood up, her movements graceful and fluid. She had been playing him all along. The trusting gesture, the moment of weakness, the carelessness with her tools. It was all a trap, a meticulous, psychological trap designed to lure him into a false sense of security. Jeremiah felt a wave of nausea, a cold, sickening realization. He was not a hunter. He was still the prey. She was a master of the game, and he was nothing but a pawn. He had lost, and now he knew the game was over. Jeremiah stood frozen, the bone file a useless tool in his hand, a symbol of his failed attempt. The air in the cabin was thick with defeat, a suffocating silence broken only by the crackle of the fire. Cora watched him, her smile a cruel, triumphant curve on her lips. "You had hope, Jeremiah," she said, her voice a soft, mocking whisper. "A fragile, foolish thing. It's the first thing I take from a man. The hope. Because without it, you are just a bag of bones waiting to be emptied." Jeremiah felt a profound sense of despair, a cold, heavy weight that settled in the pit of his stomach. He had tried to be a hero, but he had only proven himself to be another one of her victims. He had nowhere to run, no one to turn to. He was alone with his hunter, and the end was inevitable. "What now?" he asked, his voice a hoarse, defeated croak. Cora's smile widened, a terrible, chilling expression. "Now," she said, "we wait. The snow will fall, the hunger will come, and you will understand the true nature of this world. You will see what I have seen. You will understand why I do what I do." The days that followed were a blur of silent torment. Jeremiah was no longer a guest. He was a prisoner, a specimen under glass. Cora's movements were no longer graceful. They were predatory. She would watch him as he ate, as he slept, her eyes filled with a cold, unsettling curiosity. He was a puzzle she was slowly, methodically solving. He began to lose himself in the silence. The days blurred into weeks, and the world outside became a distant, forgotten memory. His mind, once a whirlwind of fear and escape plans, was now a quiet, empty room. He was a shell of a man, a ghost waiting for his end. It was on a cold, starless night, as the fire died down to a bed of embers, that she came to him. He was lying on his cot, staring into the darkness, his mind a quiet, desolate landscape. He felt her presence, a cold, silent shadow in the room. "It's time, Jeremiah," she said, her voice a low, final whisper. He didn't move. He didn't fight. He just lay there, apathetic and empty. He had no hope left. He had no will to live. He had become what she had wanted him to be, a victim who had given up. She knelt beside him, and for a long moment she just looked at him, her eyes filled with a strange, dark emotion. It was not triumph. It was not pity. It was a cold, quiet understanding. And then she did something he never expected. She reached out, not with a weapon, but with her hands, and began to untie the knots on his wrists. He looked at her, his mind struggling to comprehend. "Why?" he whispered, his voice a ghost of a sound. She smiled, a small, sad curve of her lips. "Because you understand," she said. "You are the first one, the others. They fought until the end. They clawed and screamed and cursed. But you gave up. You saw the truth. And that is a rare and beautiful thing. She stood up, and for the first time she looked vulnerable, human. This is not my home, Jeremiah. It's my cage. I came here to escape the world, but the world found me. And now, I'm a monster, a creature of the woods and the cold. She walked to the hearth and picked up a small, polished bone. It was a human finger bone, perfectly smooth, a silent testament to her dark history. She handed it to him, her eyes filled with a certain weary finality. "Go, Jeremiah," she said, her voice a low, urgent murmur. "Go and tell your story. Tell them about the woman in the woods. Tell them about the bones in the walls. But you will not be a hero, Jeremiah. You will be a messenger, a witness." He looked at her, and in that moment he saw not a monster, but a broken woman, a prisoner of her own past, her own madness. He took the bone from her hand, its cold, smooth surface a final gruesome testament to the horror he had witnessed. He stood up, his body stiff with disuse, and walked to the door. He turned, and for a long moment he just looked at her, this strange, terrifying creature who had spared his life. "Goodbye, Cora," he said, his voice a low, final whisper. She didn't answer. She just stood there, a solitary figure in the dying light of the fire, a ghost in her own cage. Jeremiah walked out into the cold, a lone figure in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. He did not look back. He had a story to tell, a truth to share. He was no longer a victim. He was a survivor. But as he walked, his boots crunching on the frozen snow, he felt a cold, empty ache in his heart. He had escaped, but he had left a piece of himself behind, a small, dark part of him that would forever be a part of the woman in the woods and the bones in her cabin walls.